Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Method Space, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Jillian Rose, who is the author of a new edition of Visual Methodologies. But before we get started, if you are new to Method Space, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing. We're interested in all things to do with designing, planning, conducting research, writing about it, and sharing results in new ways. And you can see at the heart of this Venn diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn, and it's exciting to learn from one another. I know that I will be learning some new things today as we have this conversation. So why don't you begin by introducing yourself?
Hi, well, hello. My name's Jillian Rose. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation today, Janet. So thank you for the invitation. I'm at the moment a professor of human geography at the University of Oxford. And I've been interested in visual images really from the very beginning of my academic research activity, even back to my undergraduate dissertation, actually, if I really wanted to push at it. So I'm interested in images, and particularly images as kind of social objects. So I've, alongside my just general kind of interest in sort of going to museums and exhibitions and so on, when I started doing my own research, it was evident to me that all sorts of people were using images in very many different ways to kind of achieve things in the social world. And I was particularly interested early on. I also wrote a book called Feminism and Geography, which came out in the early 1990s. At that moment when a lot of people were interested in the ways in which kind of cultural meanings, including images, visual meanings, were caught up in kind of social power relations as well. So that's always been my approach to images, to think about how they have effects in the world, they create, they produce things, they ignore other things. They're very kind of generative objects to think through. I've used them kind of illustratively. I've thought about how they've worked in archives. I've looked at the work of different visual artists, particularly feminist photographers, actually. I've looked at family snaps in a book called Doing Family Photography. How mums take photographs of their kids and what happens to those photos and how that is caught up in relations of mothering and familial relations. And more recently, I've shifted to being really interested in how so many everyday digital technologies, apps, absolutely rely on the taking and circulation of images and the effects that they have. So I've got quite an eclectic range of research interest in relation to the visual. And the book on visual methods has been, I guess, a kind of continual strand all the way through those different empirical projects. It's now in its fifth edition, which is why we're having our conversation today.
Well, as you say, I mean, the culture has shifted towards more visual communications, giving us as researchers, more opportunities. But, why don't you just, simply define, what you mean by visual methodologies?
Yeah, sure. So visual research methods, if I can start, which is slightly different from methodology, I'll come back to that. I have quite a sort of capacious definition, which is simply any kind of social science research that works with any kind of image in any way, really. And I think it's nice to be generous, not least because that reminds us that there are actually quite long traditions of using visual images in different kind of social science disciplines. So I know when the first edition came out over 20 years ago now, visual methods were seen as very new and kind of trendy, and everybody was sort of rushing around getting excited about them. But actually, of course, geographers, my discipline, and have used maps ever since centuries. Anthropologists make films. That's absolutely a core part of anthropological practice. Sociologists were using photographs very, very early on in the history of sociology as an academic discipline, and quantitative social sciences, of course, use all sorts of graphics so it's a broad definition of visual research methods, any kind of image put to some kind of social science research use. I think, though, that there has been a bit of a sort of sea change in the last couple of decades, I would say. So at that point, when I wrote the first edition of Visual Methods, I think it's fair to say that most of the research on visual methods would have been looking at found visual images. So things like art history, film studies, and so on. They were the kind of literatures I was turning to. More recently, there's been much more interest in either researchers themselves making images of different kinds. So lots of people picking up cameras, making photo essays. And of course, as you say, now camera technologies are so easily available. And of course, you can distribute those images and share them much more widely as well now. I think that's become just more, practically easy and popular. And also a growing interest in asking research participants to create images as part of the research method as well. So lots more techniques around. I think, though, what the book really tries to emphasize is that just because there are a lot of new techniques around, you still have to be really thoughtful about why you're using them. What you think a particular image is, what you think it does in the world, and therefore what kind of evidence you think it's going to be producing will be helpful for your particular research question. So the book is called Visual Methodologies rather than Visual Methods, and it starts off with something that's got increasingly difficult to write, as you might imagine, over the years, but a kind of overview, not of methods, but of visual culture theory, and trying to sort of explore different ways of thinking about what images are and what they do, which then help you to choose what kind of approach to images you want to deploy when you're thinking about a particular research question and a particular method.
Right. The fact that something is easily available doesn't necessarily mean that we can just kind of plop it into the middle of a study without really building it into the whole framework for the design. So I think, one of the kind of areas that we have to think about, around that is it's, as you say, it's very easy now to take pictures, to share images, to share even the interactive process of creating images, because we have such availability of those tools on. I mean, I think, when you and I started doing this kind of work, computers didn't necessarily come with a web camera. The availability of a camera, video camera on a phone and on every device makes it easy to do. But then, we do run into a whole nother set of ethical questions around the use of images and how they are, fit into the study, and also how they might fit into any kind of publications that we're using. And I know that the ethical practice is a big part of your work. So, maybe you could discuss some of those issues.
Yeah. So I think. And obviously research ethics is incredibly important and also incredibly complex and context specific very often. I can't remember which edition it appeared in, but certainly there is now a chapter in the book devoted to these questions of research ethics. And it points to quite a lot of other very thoughtful discussions about ethics. So I think it's absolutely critical that, as well as getting your theory right early on, you sort of think very carefully about the ethical consequences of your work. And I think also it's useful to think through that distinction that you just made, Janet, which is there may be different considerations in terms of sort of gathering and collating and analysing your data. And then a different set of considerations might appear in terms of thinking about publications or putting them on an exhibition or tweeting them or whatever it might be. So there's all sorts of. But I did jot down a little list here of sort of particularly pertinent things in relation to visual methods, things to think through rather than sort of absolutely hard and fast rules. And of course, a lot of the issues are actually not that dissimilar to any kind of research data for sure. One, though, that does crop up, particularly if you're working with found images, is kind of legal considerations, which I just kind of flag because it's very complicated, and the law around things like sort of copyright and intellectual property and so on vary, between different legal jurisdictions. So I recently was published a book with Amsterdam University Press, and they had quite different requirements for what I'm used to dealing with in UK-based publishers around what the clearances they wanted for the illustrations that were going to be included in the book chapters. So generally, you need to think about copyright permissions and so on in the, as I say, in the right kind of legal conditions. There's also, if you're interested in social media imagery, the question of the terms of service that you sign up to when you open a social media account with a platform. And certainly this is a fast changing picture, so I won't name particular platforms, but certainly some of them do not want you to download sort of data, including images. Now, I think some people get around that by taking the occasional screenshot, but certainly, kind of running software that will enable you to scrape platforms. Some platforms you're not allowed to do that legally, will sue you. So legal. Another issue around ethics is the consent of the people who've made the images that you want to study. And again, loads of possible examples here, but I do just want to flag that there's quite a lively debate among social media researchers, particularly around whether images that have been posted online publicly that are available, you can see, can you legitimately use them as data for your research project without getting the permission of the people who posted them, and indeed potentially the people who are pictured, if there are any, in the images that are, and the Association of Internet Researchers has thought about this for a long time, long and hard, and they have this quite interesting method actually that they've got like their initial statement of this, and then as subsequent iterations of discussion have occurred, they basically just added those to the existing discussion. So if you go to their website, their ethics document is extensive and detailed and really very nuanced, and I highly recommend it actually if you're working with social media images. There's kind of no right and wrong, but they absolutely work through all the kind of possible things you might want to consider before reaching your own decision. One of the more obvious issues that came up very early on in visual research methods, particularly methods that are using photographs, is the question of anonymity. Most research ethics protocols assume that the researcher will offer anonymity to their research participants. That's the kind of default, and you sort of have to explain if you don't why or not. Now, of course, if you're working with photographs and they picture your research participants or other identifiable individuals, you've immediately got an issue there about anonymity. Whether you can blur faces in the picture, or whether you might not want to use them at all in any kind of public, output context. So there's a whole set of issues there about anonymity. And then the final issue, which I did just want to flag, and it's actually just about the content of the images that you're sharing. And I think that, this was always the case. And I certainly remember ages ago sitting in a presentation which was looking at 19th century photographs taken in the context of colonial photography, profoundly racializing and racist photography being flipped through in a very casual way in a presentation, and I was very uncomfortable about seeing those being projected without any kind of sort of flagging of what I felt were their really sort of vicious representations. And of course, social media, there's all sorts of ways in which social media images can be very deeply racist, sexist, pornographic, violent in all sorts of ways. So I think generally there might be a question around, when you reproduce an image, just thinking a little carefully about its content. Should it have, maybe trigger warnings? Maybe you wouldn't want to reproduce it at all because you think it's so awful. So there's a more sort of general sense of a kind of ethical approach to working with images. I think that's also worth, absolutely should be thought through in a particular context.
Right. I think you make a good point in the distinction between kind of who's going to see the images? You know, are you as a researcher going to, you know, analyze this data and write about it, perhaps even create visualizations that capture some themes that you've found, or you know, you create something that you know is your intellectual property that you know will represent the study, but not the images would not be shared, you know, with the public. Of course, you know, if you're a doctoral student, or you know, within a research team, then you know who else is going to be able to view those images. And then, you know, even if you are thinking, well, no one else is going to view this image, you know, that will, you know, reveal the identity of this participant, then, you know, we have, I think, a great responsibility to protect the data. And I mean, it used to be, you know, in the olden days where it would be, you know, you had to sign off to say, well, the data is going to be, you know, in a locked drawer somewhere or something. Well, you know, we don't have that kind of data anymore. So, you know, I think there are a lot of, you know, questions for today's researchers to think about, you know, where are you storing the data that you are trying to protect, because it is either very sensitive or will reveal the identity of the participants, and you know, how will you protect that? I mean, for example, I mean, in my writing about online research, you know, I talk about, if you're using a platform like the one we're on today, you know, record to your own hard drive versus to the cloud, because then at least, you know that it's on, you know, you can password protect it on your own, in your own files, versus having it be, you know, on someone else's server where, you know, the company may be bought or change their policies, and suddenly, you know, all of your stuff has been revealed, which has happened, you know, with the tumult in the tech industry. So I think, you know, lots to consider about data collection and how you use the images that, you know, is perhaps not as simple as, you know, a new or inexperienced researcher might think, well, you know, just take pictures of stuff, and
I think
there are all these pictures out there. If it's on the web, then surely I can use this, and you know, really can get into some trouble.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are risks. And I think the important thing is to remember that the images of whatever, you know, if you collect them, make them, create them as part of a project, they are research data, and they should therefore be subject to formal research ethics reviews. And also, I've just had the joy of completing a data management plan for a funded research project, which actually is interesting, because they're very concerned about privacy and all the issues that you've just raised. But in the UK context, they also are very keen on making research data open and accessible. And that there's quite a tension there. And I think working with visual projects, again, you know, there are no hard and fast rules. You just have to kind of figure out, you know, depending on your topic you're interested in, you know, the kind of audiences you're anticipating, you know, how much control you're going to have over where, you know, any reproduced images travel and so on. You know, you have to come up with something that seems as least risk as possible, I guess, to your research participants.
So let's talk a moment around, you know, some of the options around data collection. So as you, you know, mentioned in your introduction, we can collect images that are, you know, have been created by someone else, whether they are in print, in an archives, you know, because, you know, there are still things that are not digitized. I know that might be hard for some people to believe, but, you know, there are some things where you actually have to go into an archive and pull it out. But at the same time, you know, given the advances in fields like digital humanities, where, you know, in amazing collections of historical materials are available through archives, etc. And then we have, you know, on the other side, kind of generating visuals, you know, within the research experience. So why don't you talk a little bit about what, you know, what you've explored in those kinds of options?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you've just given a really nice summary of all the possible options that are available. So you could, yeah, I mean, the locations in which you can find sort of ready-made images are pretty much infinite. And increasingly, I think a lot of researchers are being much more sort of creative than they were sort of 20 or 30 years ago around thinking about how they can generate images as part of the research process, either themselves, so photo essays, either sort of creative, expressive photo essays, or more kind of documentary, or as I say, ask research participants to draw maps or take their own photos or create collages, or there are endless sorts of lists around this. I think for my part, I'm this is not quite answering a question, but I think when you're thinking about where to find images, for me, as a geographer, geographers are very interested in places and how things happen differently in different places. And I think for me, it's always been really important to remember that images are embedded, as I said, they have social meanings, but they're also always embedded in places and in particular ways of seeing, therefore. So for example, I've written a paper on going to an archive and really trying to think quite hard about how the whole sort of infrastructure of the archive itself, like the building, cataloging system, the fact that in the archive I went to, you had to kind of wash your hands and put on white gloves before you could look at the photographs I was interested in. The kind of quietness. Carolyn Steedman has written a great book called Dust, which is all about the kind of, the coldness of the archive, because the books had to be read, and the fact that, there's a smell to a lot of archives, a kind of dusty, decaying paper, leather bound kind of smell. And it does seem to me that an image that you research in that kind of archive is going to, I think you are going to approach it very differently from one that you will access on an online database. And that's the kind of an example of how I think it's really important to think about, what you think an image is, and therefore, how you want to sort of approach it from the get-go. Because if it's just the kind of visual content you're interested in, like literally, what objects are shown, and then actually doing a big online search, Google image search, with some qualifications, fine, But if you're interested in an object as, a social object, as something that has a kind of agency in a particular place in relation to particular social practices, family photographs stuck on a mantelpiece are very different from looking at a family photo that's been archived in some grand museum. Then you might you would have to maybe want to go to the archive and think about that, that your role as a researcher there, or as I did, go and talk to mums, sit down with them with their family albums and their boxes of then printed family photos and say, well, why did you take this one? What did you do with it? Where do you display them? And have a much more kind of emplaced sense of how an image works. Yeah, so there's lots of questions actually about where to, as with any idea of the field site, I suppose, or the data generation site, there's lots of things to think about in terms of how how you're imagining images themselves work.
But it's so exciting, though. I mean, the opportunity that we have today to use visual images, as you say, to understand so much more the meaning and the context of these, especially for qualitative researchers who are interested in the lived experience. Well, how is that represented, and why, and where, and and then what happens with those images, whether we're looking at historical pre-internet way back when, or more recent up to the moment kinds of things, as people are communicating more using visuals, not only still but media. It just gives us so many opportunities. And so that's why I think it's really important to have a book like your Visual Methodologies book, not just as a textbook perhaps in a class, but for researchers to be able to consult while they are designing, conducting working through, thinking through the options. I think, a lot of times kind of it really becomes one of those things where, you keep digging deeper as you find more, meanings and significance in what you've located.
And I think the other, for me, the other exciting thing is that as the books progress through its various editions, actually, visual cultures, I think, has changed really profoundly with the use of smartphone apps, basically. And I was trying one of the methods I wanted to talk more about in the book, and I couldn't really find anybody publishing about it yet, is a method I've seen some of my students here actually use very effectively, which is to do an interview when you sit down with somebody with their phone out, and of course, ethical, and they kind of talk you through their Instagram feed, or they talk you through, what they're seeing on their screen. And I think that again, that's the kind of particular approach to thinking about images, not just as content, but as how people, as you say, are engaging with them, using with them, sharing them, commenting, liking. And the other, so that's kind of big, going deep into the more qualitative approach. But the other exciting development, I think, in relation to digital images is people trying new kinds of digital methods. And I am happy to report that I think the chapter on digital methods in the new edition of my book is massively better than the previous one. I was actually slightly embarrassed about looking at the rereading a chapter of the 4th edition on digital methods, which was new then. I think the methods themselves have consolidated. I think people are a bit more kind of, there's more work being done, so there's more to draw on. But I think the idea of looking, because online images, we see them so quickly, we don't pause and deeply analyze them, as so many research methods assume that one does. That's what you do, you interpret an image. You scroll, you click. So there's something about kind of figuring out what they mean at scale, which is not really qualitative or quantitative, I think. It's kind of meaning at scale. And I think there's some very interesting work coming out. For example, Richard Rogers runs a summer school in Amsterdam, and there's another one, gosh, I think somewhere in Australia. This is really awful. I should have checked the details out. But people definitely experimenting a lot with those kind of methods. So there's a lot happening in this area at the moment, and I think it's very exciting because of that as well.
Yes. So you've mentioned a couple of different ways that the new edition has not only built upon but expanded on the previous edition. So, maybe you could just summarize what some of those changes people will find in this 5th edition.
Yeah, well, it's gone green, so that's one. Although I've still got my. Actually, this was the archive. The archive that these front covers come from was the one I wrote about. So for me there's a nice reference there to other work. Yeah. So the 5th edition, it's had a general kind of refresh. I've tried to remove some of the older examples and put in some more digital examples. That's absolutely, seems to be certainly what a lot of students are really interested in looking at. Although, as you say, of course, many images remain undigitized, and people still go look at oil paintings and print out family photos and all sorts of things. So we certainly shouldn't assume that everything is going digital. So there's a general refresh. I've also rejigged the introduction. I felt that I had a sort of introduction to a preface so the opening of the book has been tidied up, and it kind of starts now with a how to use this book, which in the previous edition was the 3rd chapter for some reason. I don't quite know why I thought that was a good idea, but anyway, so it starts off with a much clearer how to use the book, because it's quite chunky. There's a lot of material in it, and I doubt many readers are going to go through from page 1 all the way through to page 400 or whatever. So and there's quite a lot of tools within the book, kind of keywords, section summaries, key topics, that help you sort of navigate, get what you need from the book as efficiently as possible. It's now also divided into sections. There's one on contexts, which is the kind of visual culture, critical visual methodology kind of approach. The next one I've got on is about designing a research project. So it's got things like research design, ethics, how to reference your images, all those kind of more practical things. Then the 3rd part is on methods. So that follows the same structure, chapter per method. digital one completely rewritten. The one on psychoanalysis is gone. So I didn't feel that was a method many people were using anymore, although and then there's another completely rewritten chapter at the end on using images to disseminate research findings, because there's a lot of emphasis now, certainly in funded research projects, but I think also people just generally wanting to get their research findings out to audiences, and thinking that doing it visually, through an exhibition or a series of TikToks or whatever might be an effective way of doing that. And so there's some guidance around what you need to think about if you're considering producing some kind of visual material. So that, as I say, the overall structure has been clarified a bit, and I think that's it. I mean, it felt I spent quite a bit of time on the reworking. Yes. So I think I'm hoping it's much more usable.
Creating a new edition is definitely a lot of work, but it's also exciting to see, when you've written something that is groundbreaking, to see how the field has evolved, and then to think through the kinds of guidance that someone would need, to carry out this kind of study. So
yeah, no, for sure. And I also did so I try to be as broad as possible, but it's impossible to be comprehensive at this point. There's so much going on around visual methods. Well, even if it ever was possible to be comprehensive, it probably wasn't. But absolutely, I sent the manuscript of the final version off to the publisher, off to Sage. And of course, like the next week was full of me finding really, really interesting examples of visual research methods I would love to have included in the new edition, but I had to draw the line somewhere. But I would say that I think now, there is this huge, very wide-ranging across many disciplines, well beyond the social sciences, obviously, interest in this, and it feels very much like a kind of collective effort to really develop a new approach to research methods more generally, using several new approaches using visual materials in different ways. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be sort of part of that shift in research methods.
Well, thank you for sharing your insights about the methods in the field, as well as discussing your new edition, which I think, will be useful to researchers, whether they are just approaching this for the first time or, are experienced as researchers, but need to adapt to the changes in the field. So, thank you very much for joining me. I think that our methods-based readers will find this very much of interest.
Well, thank you for the invitation to have the conversation. It's been great. Thank you, Janet.